Okay, as we move further, this is going to be all about mobility. Bill Gross is here. He's the mobility training coordinator, and he's going to provide you some information. Also, just want to shout out here, remember there's some information about their training here on the training table, so grab anything that you need. Go ahead, Bill.
And I feel bad I don't have a lot of big books with me. I just have some of my notes. But anyway, I'm Bill Gross. I'm the mobility training coordinator, and thanks for this opportunity to talk about our program today. I've been working in our mobility program now for a little bit over a year, and this is my fourth year working for Motor Carrier. And today in this 30 minutes, we have a lot of information packed in here. We're going to be skimming over a lot of this material at a very high level, but feel free to reach out to me directly if you'd like to arrange for some additional training. Next week, we're kicking off our next installment of our quarterly brown bag series in each of the region headquarters. You can go out to our SharePoint site where we have sign-in links for iLearn. We link to our SharePoint site right off the project delivery portal, so hope you can join us next week. The topic for most of the brown bags is temporary restriction awareness, but we're also, I think in Region 3, we're doing permanent impacts as well. We are making them available on Join Me, so if you can't go in person out to the regions, obviously, you can also participate remotely. So this is a look at our staff. Again, we operate under the Motor Carrier Transportation Division. Christy Jordan is our program manager. We have 7 full-time staff. Katie Scott is our operations coordinator, so she looks over our day-to-day work. We have 2 program analysts, and they're tasked with tracking mobility impacts for your projects, as well as stakeholder engagement. Manny Boswell, and I'm happy to announce that we've hired and filled that last remaining vacant position in our unit. Curran Clean Brown accepted that position, and he's going through all his training right now, and we're looking forward to having him up to speed. Then during the construction and maintenance phases, we have 2 program specialists, Yvonne Wolf and Kyle Knuth, and they process all the highway restriction notices that come in during construction and maintenance activity work. And they also help us facilitate our Mobility Advisory Committee meetings as well. And then there's myself working on our training content. And we also, in addition, there's mobility liaisons that are assigned to each region who provide additional guidance for you folks as well. Our team works with both the liaisons and project delivery teams on project reviews. But the liaisons in each of the regions are, for Region 1, we have Carrie Springer, Region 2, Mike Doan, Region 3, Matt Malone, Region 4, Teresa Gibson, and in Region 5, Jeff Wise. So this is the definition of mobility that the Mobility Procedures Manual provides. The manual is the accepted authority for mobility policy for the agency, and it's intended to be a working tool throughout the project delivery lifecycle, from planning, project development, construction, and maintenance activity. So what's at stake with mobility coordination? First and foremost is work zone safety. So effective mobility coordination is about finding a balance between protecting the work zone and allowing freight and people to move safely on the roads through our work zones. And mobility coordination is also about keeping oversized loads from showing up where they should not in our work zones as well. Also at stake is keeping Oregon's economy on the move. To underscore this point, this is an interesting figure from the ODOT State of the System report. $270 billion worth of freight moved within to and from Oregon in 2016 on all modes of transportation. And mobility coordination also helps us protect our infrastructure and our work zones from oversized and overweight loads. Our our motor carrier overdimension permit unit issues oversize and overweight permits. And to ensure those loads don't cross weight-restricted bridges or enter work zones where they won't necessarily fit. And all of you are a key link for communicating those impacts on those permitted loads so that our unit in turn can inform the OD permit analysts as well as the trucking industry and traveling public about those restrictions. So there's two types of overdimension permits to be aware of. We have annual permits that allow unlimited trips for loads up to certain dimensions and weights on designated routes. And we have single trip permits that are route specific, and they allow unlimited trips during a 10-day period. And each of those permits are impacted in different ways by work zone restrictions that require different types of notification periods. And it's also assumed that, it's often assumed that overdimension loads can't move at night, but they actually can. Overwidth loads are allowed at night up to 12 feet wide on interstates and multi-lane highways and up to 10 feet wide on other designated routes. And central to mobility coordination is stakeholder engagement. And the mobility team is ODOT's single point of contact between you folks, the project delivery teams, and the Mobility Advisory Committee. So the committee is made up of representatives from the trucking and heavy haul industries, as well as Association of General Contractors, AAA, and others. They generally meet twice a month at our motor carrier headquarters here in Salem, as well as Region 1 headquarters up in Portland. Not all projects are reviewed by this group, but some actions, including the ones you see here on the screen, do require their input. And included in that is Oregon Revised Statute 366-215. If you're not familiar with the statute, I'll give you the brief summary, but we also have a guidance document that's available that walks through the review process in greater detail. So the law states that the Oregon Transportation Commission may not permanently reduce vehicle carrying capacity of identified freight routes. There's exceptions that are allowed for safety or access considerations, and local jurisdictions can also apply for an exemption as well. A reduction in vehicle carrying capacity, it's also known as RVC, is a reduction in the horizontal or vertical clearance of the roadway. And think of it as a hole in the air above the roadway that's needed to accommodate legal and permitted overdimension loads. To our stakeholders, their point of view is that if it fits through that hole in the air today, they want it to be able to fit through that hole in the air tomorrow. Some examples of permanent features on these designated routes that can be subject to the statute include things like raised medians, raised pedestrian islands, new signal structures, and even landscaping can be considered a potential RVC impact. So the mobility team reviews all projects that have mobility impacts on our state system. And to help with these reviews, all project teams submit a mobility considerations checklist when there are mobility impacts. So you may have heard that we recently updated this form. We wanted to include some more in-depth questions that were often asked by our stakeholders during our mobility meetings. We wanted to reduce the back and forth emailing and phone calls that resulted in so that we could try to get all of the information that our team needs to do the reviews right out of the gate. The new form is available. The link is available on our SharePoint site and as well as our website. I think it's also on the project delivery portal as well. We do have tutorial videos available on iLearn, and we also have a user guide available on our website to help you walk through completing the form. So interaction with our team and the Mobility Advisory Committee depends on the review process that's taking place. So we'll look at some of these common processes and how they fit onto the racetrack. So if your project or plans involve a proposed roundabout or a reduction in vehicle carrying capacity concern, or perhaps it includes both, the mobility team should be engaged as soon as possible so we can work with you on facilitating stakeholder input throughout that process. Both of these review types have specific required steps that need to be followed, and they're often conducted before you would submit your mobility considerations checklist to our team for review. The longer these reviews are pushed out onto the racetrack, the greater the risk of delay to your project. So with 366-215 reviews, planning documents often don't yet have enough design detail to determine if there's a reduction in vehicle carrying capacity impact. So rather than holding up agreements with local jurisdictions, you can include a statement like this one or something similar in your planning documents. Then once you do have sufficient design detail available, you can come back to our group and we can continue with the review process. If you're considering different design options at this stage, this might be a good time to also engage with industry stakeholders to get their input, which can help the review process move quicker as well. So early project communication, this takes place typically prior to DAP. In addition with consulting with our team on roundabouts and reduction reviews, we encourage TPMs to reach out to us early on things like design concepts, detour routes, and staging plans, perhaps while you're completing your mobility checklist or looking to see if some features may need some stakeholder engagement. So mobility checklist project reviews, and if necessary, review by the Mobility Advisory Committee takes place primarily during DAP. If there are mobility impacts, the checklist must be signed off by the mobility program manager and ideally by the advanced plans phase. Signed checklists are then included in the PS&E packet that's submitted to the project controls office. The closer a project gets to its PS&E date, without sharing these documents or making changes to your documents, the greater the risk of delay. And the completed checklist needs to be accompanied by a work zone decision tree and a transportation management plan. And reviews, our team can't start these reviews until all these documents are completed and submitted to our unit. So there is a process change to note as a result of the PDII Project Delivery Improvement Initiative. A draft version of the Mobility Considerations Checklist is now required at the end of DAP. The draft, basically we ask that it be as complete as possible so that our team can at least initially assess impacts and determine if a Mobility Advisory Committee review will be needed. Since we also understand the traffic control plan is also due at DAP as well, we think there should be enough detail available to plug into your mobility checklist. We're still trying to work out specific expectations as to what draft means for the checklist, and once we have those, we'll be sure to share those with you. So when transitioning to construction, it's really important that the resident engineer review the restrictions and commitments that were signed off on the checklist during project development, especially considering quite a bit of time can take place between those two stages. So during construction, it's important to engage with the mobility team before making changes that might affect mobility or run counter to those stakeholder commitments that were signed off in the checklist. Ideally, the information in the checklist should be consistent with the information that's submitted on the highway restriction notice form. If you're not familiar with the highway restriction notice form, when we work to close a highway or a ramp or restrict size or weight of a route on our state system, The highway restriction notice form is filled out, which is submitted to our team prior to the work taking place that will affect that restriction. Our team then checks the information on that form to make sure it's consistent with the information that's in your project checklist. If there are changes that are significantly different than what's in the checklist or run counter to those stakeholder agreements, the notice is then returned to the submitter for possible engagement with the Mobility Advisory Committee again. So it's really important to engage with our team before it gets to that point so we can avoid any construction delays. So next we'll look at some major mobility deliverables and what we need from you and what you need from us. So with Oregon Revised Statute 366215, the main deliverable is a formal record of support. What we need from you on this is a presentation that contains all of the information that you see here on the left of the screen, and we'll need it at least 2 weeks in advance of the scheduled Mobility Advisory Committee meeting. Typically, TPMs are requested to present this information at the meeting, and you may want to have a technical expert available in the room as well to answer any questions that might come up. Keep in mind also that project teams still need to provide a mobility considerations checklist once your work zone traffic control plans are available. So what you'll need from us is you'll want to review our 366215 guidance document about the review process. You can look on our website for upcoming Mobility Advisory Committees meetings to find one that fits your project schedule. As an option, we do provide a PowerPoint template that you can use to prepare your presentation materials. It can save time. It's not required, but you can use it if you'd like to. And after the meeting, if the stakeholder forum supports your proposed action, you'll need a formal record of support for your project that is prepared by our team. So with roundabout memorializations, what we need from you on these is to engage our mobility team early and often throughout planning and design so we can involve stakeholders throughout that process. This includes stakeholder input on all options that are being considered for the intersection. We also need you to follow Highway Directive DES-02. This is the roundabout directive, which sets expectations and processes for trucking industry communications. And if the the proposed roundabout is located on a reduction review route, we'll also need the required information listed on the previous slide for 366215 reviews. And what you'll need from us, you may want us to provide over-dimension permit data about the proposed location so you can assess the types of over-dimension loads that use that route through that proposed location. We can also provide you with vehicle diagrams for auto turn analysis as well. And again, the mobility team is your point of contact for all communication and coordination of meetings. After the review, your team's going to need a memorialized agreement with the trucking industry on roundabout sizing. And then again, if it is located on a proposed reduction review route, you're going to need that formal record of support document prepared as well. With signed mobility considerations checklists, what we need from you on these, we need the checklist answered with all of the questions thoroughly answered. We also need a completed work zone decision tree and transportation management plan. Again, we can't start the review until we get all three of those documents together. So what is a transportation management plan and work zone decision tree? ODOT's work zone safety guiding principle provides guidance on both of those documents. The TMP, in a summary here, is used to document strategies to manage temporary work zone impacts. And the work zone decision tree is used to document work zone safety options, impacts, stakeholder input, recommendations, and decisions. The project delivery process requires both of those documents for STIP projects during scoping, project development, design, and during construction. And so what you'll need from us on checklist reviews, first off, you'll need us to determine if a Mobility Advisory Committee review is necessary. Sometimes checklists can be signed off directly by our team if the impacts are minor, or if other mobility standards can be met, such as accommodating over-dimensioned loads unannounced at the work zone. If you do need to present your project at a MAC meeting, you'll want to review, again, the upcoming meeting dates and find one that works best for your project schedule. We also have a different PowerPoint template available for these presentations that can help you prepare as well. Typically, again, the TPM is asked to present this information at our MAC meetings, and you also may want to have technical experts available there as well to answer questions. Projects, again, with mobility impacts need to have their checklists signed off by our mobility manager and the region project lead. And the best way to get your project signed off before the PS&E deadline, again, is to answer all those questions as thoroughly as possible. The amount of time that it takes to go through the reprocess depends on the complexity of the project. Our team does review projects from all 5 regions, and they generally try to address them in the order that they're received. But again, it's just important that you don't send it to us, say, 2 weeks before your PS&E date. So we'll go through some fatal flaws. For the mobility considerations checklist, the biggest one is missing or conflicting information. Sometimes we'll see mobility considerations checklists that might be missing staging widths, restriction hours and durations, detours, and critical route pair conflicts. I think the sign says it all. We're trying to get as much specificity about your restrictions as possible. Projects shared too close to your PS&E date can also cause delays. And again, during construction, changes that are made affecting mobility or the commitments to stakeholders during construction without first engaging with our team can also lead to delays. For 366-215 reviews, some fatal flaws, reduction of vehicle carrying capacity issues were never considered. So we've seen that happen before. The review process is started too late in the racetrack. Assuming that secondary routes don't have over-dimension loads. Presentation materials are missing some of those critical information lists that I showed you in a previous slide. Or assuming that the common semi-truck is the largest vehicle that needs to be accommodated on that reduction review route. With roundabout reviews, some of the issues to look out for, making, again, assumptions that the size of the vehicles that need to be accommodated. Again, many routes are used by vehicles much larger than the common semi-truck. You can contact our team. We can provide you with a report of permit data so you can assess the mobility traffic that uses the proposed location. Engaging local stakeholder groups before engaging our mobility team. The Mobility Advisory Committee is made up of statewide industry stakeholders, and they're concerned with the overall impacts to the corridor and the statewide system, and only engaging with local stakeholder groups doesn't meet mobility requirements. Assumptions that secondary routes don't carry over-dimension loads is also one on this roundabouts. Some routes are frequently used by over-width farm implements, and also secondary routes are often the last mile connection for over-dimension loads being delivered to local communities. And finally, not engaging industry stakeholders for input on alternative options for the intersection. So again, engage the mobility team early and often during this process. And here's a list of resources that you might find helpful as you're going about your project delivery. A lot of these links are also on our SharePoint site, and some of these documents are also contained in these mobility guidance kits that we have available on our table over there. Again, hopefully, look forward to if you'd like to sign up for our brown bags next week. Love to see you there. In the meantime, I'd be happy to take any questions that you have.
Okay, are we on?
I just have a comment. For the TPMs and RECPs in the room here, how many of you have gone before the Mobility Advisory Committee? So quite a few. And how many of you have been impacted by waiting for that checklist to come in that could affect your PS&E day? Raise your hand. So I know that we have a ways to go in terms of standardizing processes for taking projects to the Mobility Advisory Committee. And so I think the tools that Bill has laid out is going to be very helpful moving forward as we continue to provide data and information and navigate through that process.
Saw a couple hands here. Kim, do you want to? Thank you.
I'm just wondering what mobility is doing to address the increased need for pedestrian safety on highways, where the typical fix is generally narrowing the roadway, say in the instance of bulbed out sidewalks and things like this.
Sure. I think a lot of those discussions come up during 366-215 reviews. That's typically when that reduction of vehicle carrying capacity discussion comes up. The committee does represent broad stakeholder groups. I believe we also invite folks from the bike and ped communities. I'm not sure how much participation we get from them on those communities. But as far as standards, are you talking about standards for those bulletabouts and so forth, or is that?
Just asking what's being done to address that issue, because it seems to be kind of a direct conflict.
Yeah, sure. And a lot of times in those discussions, we're also relying on those technical experts to attend and answer questions about ADA requirements for access, how those ramps are supposed to be designed. A lot of times those experts can provide some of the explanation of why those bulbouts are needed to meet those accessibility standards. I know in some recent meetings, some of those bulbouts have come up, and I think when that's explained in those meetings, it's understood, the need for providing additional space on the sidewalk. I hope that answers your question. Sure.
Bill, my question is, what is the role of mobility in hazmat transport on the route?
That's a great question. So I think one of the biggest considerations for hazardous materials is when you're planning your detours and your alternate routes, if you need to do a closure. Hazardous materials, I'll give you an example, fuel tankers, I believe, are not allowed to go through the tunnel in Portland. So if your detour route involves that route, you need to consider other options for those vehicles. So I think detour planning is the biggest consideration. And also in the work zone itself, so considering all traffic that uses the roadway, including hazardous materials, can certain widths, weights, et cetera, handle all those, all traffic, including hazardous materials. So.
Other questions? Oh, great.
So the mobility checklist meant to be for ODOT facility only, not on local roads, right?
It is intended for all projects that impact the state system and off-system projects that also impact the state system. So if you have, for example, a local county road that perhaps impacts an on-ramp onto a state system, that would require use of the mobility considerations checklist as well.
Other questions for Bill?
If there are standards for designs of intersections and roundabouts, and I could be coming of a position of inexperience here, but why would we need to consider like the trucking industry or mobility when the standards take into consideration design of those types of vehicles and say like turning, sweeping path movements and things like that?
Sure. In discussions and commitments to the trucking industry, a lot of those discussions went into the formation of ODOT's Roundabout Directive, DESO2, and that policy actually requires an engagement with the industry on freight mobility accommodation, including the sizing of the roundabout, the types of vehicles that will be accommodated. I think it's just ingrained in that policy to have that engagement as part of that design process. I know there's been some discussion about interpretation, different interpretations about those policies. And I know our manager, Christy Jordan, has been documenting those interpretations among the regions as well as among stakeholders. And she's been communicating those to management to take a look at the policy level. The Mobility Procedures Manual does require engagement with the trucking industry, not just on roundabout planning, but all plans and temporary work zone planning as well. So I think that engagement is just ingrained in our policies.
Any other questions? Going, gone. All right, Bill, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.